Hi there, and welcome to this panel that marks the 10th anniversary of The Conversation, a platform for scientific publication edited by journalists. The Conversation started in Australia in 2011 and so marks its 10th anniversary this year. We have 4 papers in this panel. The first of these looks at the role of The Conversation in the circulation of preprint content during the COVID-19 pandemic. The second looks more broadly at the circulation of conversation content on Facebook in Australia and Canada. The third shifts our gaze to Africa and investigates the uptake of conversation articles from the Conversation Africa more broadly. And finally, we are considering the Conversation as an amplifier platform for scientific knowledge and investigate its role in generating public engagement with science. We hope you enjoyed the panel.
Hi, I'm Michelle Riedlinger and I'm presenting this research on behalf of our group. And I'm talking about the conversation coverage of preprint research, and that's research that has not been peer-reviewed. In early research that I conducted with Alice and others, we found that during the first 4 months of 2020, The Conversation was one of 15 media outlets most frequently reporting on COVID-19 research via preprints. The Conversation published 41 stories linking to one or more of the 100 most cited preprints, and we found that fewer than half of these stories included linguistic strategies describing the preprint research as scientifically uncertain or unverified. Now, understanding the online circulation of these stories is important because of the Conversation's role as an amplifier platform and also its mandate to provide evidence-based content that audiences can use. So the research explores social media amplification of the Conversation articles that mention COVID-19 preprint research, and today I'm presenting on our Facebook research findings. So I'm looking at who is sharing the Conversation articles and how users are engaging with scientific uncertainty when sharing these Conversation articles. So in terms of our first research question, who is sharing, we used CrowdTangle and we pulled all publicly available Facebook posts for 2020 that shares links to one or more of the 41 stories in the Conversation. And we collected 315 public posts, and these public posts were shared nearly 10,000 times. Facebook user engagement was issues-based with these stories, and we can talk more about that on the panel when we meet. And over half of the Facebook users sharing these stories were citizens. We categorised them as citizens, and or they were posting to Facebook groups, and these groups were often geolocated or focused on health information sharing. Most Facebook users posting, most of these spaces did not have any political identification information provided. We're also interested in how users were engaging with scientific uncertainty when posting these links. And we found that users mostly reshared posts without any comment, or they contextualised the findings for their followers or fellow group members by highlighting what was important or relevant in the article. But scientific claims weren't qualified as uncertain or needing verification very often. I'm sure we'll have some Twitter findings to share with you by the time we meet at AIR, and we can talk about next steps in the project, but I'd like to thank these individuals and groups who've helped us with the research.
Hi there. In this, we're looking at the overall distribution of links to The Conversation on Facebook in Australia and Canada. The Conversation is a platform, of course, for scientific content edited by journalists. It was established in Australia in 2011 and a Canadian edition launched in 2017. And these are the 2 editions that we're particularly looking at. We've gathered data from CrowdTangle on posts by Australian and Canadian Facebook pages, where the majority of admins are located in those countries. In 2020, that linked to one of 41 Australian or 71 Canadian news domains, including The Conversation. That, of course, has some limitations. For Australia, we gathered 1.4 million posts in 2020, and the distribution is as such. There's a significant rise in early 2020 when the pandemic kicks off. The Conversation itself is located somewhere outside the top 10 of sites, so it's fairly well established in Australia. Looking at the link sharing network, so the network between pages and the domains that they share, we see that there is a central cluster, and the conversation is located just outside of that central cluster. Its links are often also shared alongside other mainstream news outlets. If we reduce this down just to a network between domains, that is, which domains are most frequently shared by the same pages, we see the conversation very much part of that central cluster, which is made up of mainstream and center-left news outlets. And there is a separate cluster made up of conservative outlets run by a News Corporation. In the on-sharing networks, the on-sharing of Facebook posts that contain links by other pages, we see clustering, particularly around topical themes as well as location, and we see that conversation links here are particularly shared in more progressive clusters. There is some sharing in conservative clusters as well, but that's often critical rather than supportive of conversation content. In Canada, we've gathered a similar number of posts, 1.5 million for 2020. Here we see a lesser impact of the pandemic in terms of sharing, and a curious drop down in sharing of globalnews.ca that we haven't fully explained yet. The conversation is located somewhere further down the ranking. It simply isn't as well established here as it is in Australia. In the link sharing network, we see that the conversation is located quite a bit outside of the central cluster. Where its links are being shared, they often occur, if at all, with other major news outlets in Canada. But again, the conversation is located much further out from the central cluster of the network here. And that central cluster is made up of mainstream news outlets by and large. There are also two other clusters that are driven by company ownership. The Post Media and Black Press Group outlets also cluster together here. In the Canadian on-sharing network, again, we see a mix of thematic and localized clustering, particularly a cluster for Quebec, which is quite separate from the rest of the Canadian network, perhaps not surprisingly. And here, conversation content is largely shared, if at all, alongside other progressive content in progressively oriented clusters. So overall, what we're seeing here is that the conversation in Australia is fairly widely shared, but mostly in centrist and centre-left contexts, and that there is some tendency towards polarization in the Australian network overall. In Canada, we're seeing that the conversation is not yet strongly established, but there is some sharing at the centre of the network, and largely the shape of the network is driven by ownership of particularly the minor outlets as well. There are, of course, some limitations, and we will do some further work with this data. We will also record a longer video that presents more of these findings in more detail. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your interest in our presentation, Novel Interfaces in Science Communication, comparing journalistic and social media uptake of articles published by The Conversation Africa. I will report on a joint project between researchers from Germany and South Africa. Our study is set in the context of the rise of digital and social media, which has affected the way science becomes news. The business model of traditional journalism has come under pressure, with novel interfaces such as The Conversation emerging. Scientists are also increasingly asked to engage with the public through outreach activities. Many of them use amplifier platforms such as The Conversation and reach audiences without gatekeepers involved. With a specific focus on The Conversation Africa, our aim was twofold. We wanted to know more about the nature and the impact of this platform. The nature of the platform delivers general insights into The Conversation Africa's agenda-setting function. For the impact, we were especially interested in differences between which stories are reprinted in journalism and which are shared on social media, as this tells us something about different logics of intermedia agenda setting. Towards answering the two research questions, we obtained metadata from the Johannesburg office of The Conversation Africa and considered the first 5 years from its launch in 2015. For data analysis, we rely on descriptive analyses as well as keyword clustering performed with VOS-Viewer. 8 topical clusters were identified. To compare journalistic republishing with social media sharing, we looked at differences regarding thematic sections and the 8 topical clusters. To describe The Conversation Africa as an agenda setter, we found that most articles were published in the politics and society, business and economy, and health and medicine sections. Our keyword clustering supported this, as there were 3 clusters alone that directly addressed political issues. You can see them on the right. Hence, as an agenda setter, The Conversation Africa seems to have a strong focus on political and economic topics, which differs from what we know about science journalism that usually has a strong focus on medicine and natural sciences. The differences we found between journalistic republishing and social media sharing were alike across thematic sections and topical clusters. Journalistic republishing was more common for political and economical keywords and clusters. You can see that in the graph when looking at the yellow bubbles. For Facebook shares, this changes as keywords and clusters related to academia and education, as well as conservation and wildlife, are more popular here. This picture is very similar for Twitter shares. Hence, as an intermediate agenda setter, the Conversation Africa supplements journalistic reporting quite differently from what is most often shared on social media. There's much more to say and to discuss. Please check out our recent publication or contact us. Thank you very much.
Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Quandamooka people as the traditional owners of the land I'm on today. Today, I'm going to introduce the initial phase of our research for the Global Journalism Innovation Lab that examines what happens to the conversation articles after they're published on theconversation.com. The purpose of this research is to understand how people engage with academic content as part of their everyday media streams, and this stems from a series of interviews we did with academics in Australia and Canada who acknowledge the benefit of being able to identify and engage with niche publics and stakeholders on digital media. Not only to prove the impact of their publicly funded research, but because as researchers, it's nice to know where our work is being shared and that it has meaning and value to end users. To identify popular content on different platforms, we used metrics from theconversation.com across its 10 editions in 4 languages. And we used the search tool from social media monitoring platform CrowdTangle to identify the conversation articles that were shared on Facebook. These are the most popular articles on the conversation, and it's worth noting here that this is based on cumulative readership of the article. So even though older articles have the potential to build up reads over time, like the articles on sex and sugar, the audience for the conversation has grown significantly in the last 12 to 18 months. And so you can see articles about COVID-19 with a comparable readership. Please pause if you'd like to have a closer look at each list. And if any titles take your fancy, you can head on over to the conversation to read them. I get sidetracked doing this all the time. But the most widely shared articles on Facebook, according to CrowdTangle, are these. Well, the articles with the most engagements are slightly different. And you can see the article, "It takes just 6 minutes for a dog to die in a hot car," has over twice the engagements for the next most popular article. Well, on the conversation itself, it's not even in the top 1,000. So we're starting to see that engagements on social media don't always translate to metrics or reads on theconversation.com. We then took a step back from identifying articles to look at the types of topics that are popular on each platform. We found differences among the content topics that generate comments on each platform, with Australian politics ranking highly on the conversation itself, which makes sense given the Australian edition is the most established, while coronavirus and, interestingly, pets and cats generate comments on Facebook. Our next steps are qualitatively identifying topic themes, identifying who is sharing a topic-based sample of the conversation content, and analysing how it's being framed in posts and how it's being discussed in groups. So undertaking a qualitative analysis of the conversation about the conversation. Thanks very much for your time.